Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. And Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
Doing fine.
Good.
Have a couple things I want to talk about today. First thing is Persian Gulf is still hot. And potential danger there because there was the story about, the Iranians were going to play the same game that the British did, and they were going to take a British ship. And we'll talk about that later, but before we get started, I wanted to call attention to our viewers this poll, Pew Poll, which more or less supports our contention that people don't like war.
Yeah.
And the question is, why do we have so many wars? And this poll comes out pretty good. It shows, which explains maybe why I was getting good donations during the run-up and when I was running, because I got money from the military. But the military people involved, whether they were in combat or not, I think it was a waste of time and wasted money. And then they took it and they compared it to the American people. And guess what? The American people, they weren't very excited either. They think it's a waste of time. To me, the disappointment is, yes, it's great that you come around to it, but we have to get the understanding out there before the problem. That's why we work so hard to try to prevent this. But I'm sure you saw the Pew Poll.
Yeah, it's interesting. We have a couple of clips from the main findings. What's important is that 2/3 of American veterans believe the war in Iraq was not worth fighting. And that is just incredible. 2/3 of American veterans, even more than all adults. Then you have 60%, almost 6 in 10, say the war in Afghanistan wasn't worth it. And you have a good solid majority saying what the U.S. military is doing in Syria is not worth it. So that's pretty strong numbers, and it's pretty significant. And as you point out, it doesn't make a difference whether these vets were in these conflicts or not. It's a survey of 1,300 veterans in May and June by Pew, and it was just released yesterday. The other thing important I think we can talk about too is overall the vets are a lot more supportive of Trump even than regular Republicans.
Mm-hmm. And when they broke it down by parties, it was what one would expect, which is a disappointment because I thought Republicans were conservatives and constitutionalists, and there was a time when Republicans tended to be the anti-war party. But no, it comes out very dramatically in favor of the Democrats being more opposed to war than the Republicans. But and I think this probably explains why our allies, when I was in Congress, were frequently the progressive Democrats. But what we need to do, expand that base on the anti-war position, because overall, 2/3 of the American people and the veterans really opposed to war.
And I think that's something that if I was President Trump, I would be paying a lot of attention, because according to that same poll, more than 90% of Republican veterans approve of Trump's military leadership. So they're strongly behind him, but also strongly anti-war. And actually, if we have that second little graphic from the poll too, that's also interesting because it talks about how they feel about the way Trump is dealing with each of the following. They strongly approve of how he's dealing with North Korea, which is diplomacy, strongly agree with him being a little more firm with our NATO allies, even more than all adults, and they're strongly in favor of his policy toward Russia. Remember, he ran on let's get along with Russia. So if I was the president and I was looking at how these veterans who overwhelmingly vote Republican were thinking, I would take some serious note.
You'd think also that the primary candidates in the Democratic election would be speaking out against the war.
Yeah.
And they're all supporting for the deep state.
Yeah.
And, they could fit into the Hillary foreign policy. And none of them mention except for Tulsi.
Yeah,
and she brings it up, which should help her a lot because, the other ones are ignoring it. But I think this represents, in spite of these people being the most of the candidates in the Democratic primary, they're establishment people. They're supporting this stuff, and yet even their own people don't support it. So maybe they'll wake up. Maybe this whole thing will change. But ultimately, though, the deep state has a lot of influence, and of course the donations go in certain areas when you take positions on foreign policy.
Yeah, it would make sense if I was a Democrat. I would look at this and say, well, you know, my point would be that he's not fulfilling his promises on this. He's not doing enough.
Yeah, right.
Who knows? You know.
Okay, I want to talk about some naval activity in the Persian Gulf. We do know that a week or so ago, the British Marines stormed Grace 1.
Yeah.
That was a ship carrying oil, probably to Syria. And they made this effort, but they were stopped at Gibraltar. And this was pretty offensive to the Iranians. So they said, you better watch out what you're doing. We're liable to retaliate. And it looked like that's what was happening. And of course, there was some close calls, with British ships and with a tanker, and the people that were doing this, said, the report was, the Iranians tried to get this British ship and they totally failed and made it look like they were. That was my first impression.
Yeah.
Maybe that little navy they have isn't so sharp, and yet later on we find out, well, it was CNN that reports the total failure, and there was no confrontation. Ships get close together all the time. I'm sure it's on their mind, and someday something like that's going to happen. But it isn't ever in context of what has been done to Iran. It's just that, oh yes, the Iranians, we have to watch them. So it looks like the confrontation didn't occur, but it looks like it was a PR struggle here. Who gets the blame for something that really didn't happen?
Yeah, I do smell neocon fingerprints on this, to be honest, because the source of this, according to Zero Hedge, which we looked at, the source of the whole story was 2 U.S. officials with direct knowledge of the incident. One of them may or may not be John Bolton, but they're putting these stories out that the Iranians were coming up to this British ship and the British Navy turned their guns on them and said, get away and everything. And it's very... it starts being very suspicious. They claim to have video. We haven't seen any video of it yet. So, and remember the seizure of the Grace 1, and it was a scheduled stop in Gibraltar to take on provisions. So it wasn't like they went in there by surprise, but it was at the behest of the U.S. So the U.S. is doing something here. May not have been something that President Trump himself suggested, that seize the ship, then start spreading stories about how the Iranians are trying to seize other ships. It just smells a little bit funny to me.
Well, because of this problem, and there's not a free flow of ships in the Persian Gulf, and there's these big questions, our chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Dunford, he thinks we should have a little meeting with our allies to guarantee freedom of travel on the seas. Freedom of navigation. I wonder if he's thinking about freedom of navigation for the Iranians.
Yeah.
I don't think he is, but to them they talk about in glowing terms about freedom of the seas and navigation, and we got to protect it. And at the same time, we're out there participating in absolutely unbelievable prevention of a country to survive, because they just decided that Iran is not supposed to survive. So this whole idea, what a farce. We're going to have a convention to make sure there's freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf. So it really puts Iran in a box. It's a dangerous situation. And I keep thinking, what would the American people say to us, to say to our politicians, if China took a vessel that was even hauling oil out of this country and going somewhere and say, oh no, you can't do that, and confiscate it and take it on? I mean, there would be a war in no time. Yeah. And yet it's supposed to be a non-event, and oh yes, we have to make those bad leaders in Iran suffer. But they don't. They punish the civilians. They put on sanctions. We'll starve those people, and then they'll overthrow their government, which has been proven always to be a miscalculation.
It's like the U.S. is lighting brush fires and then it wants to claim the credit when it puts out the fires.
Right.
The Dunford thing is interesting because who's threatened that freedom in the Gulf? It's the U.S. It's U.S. activity that's threatened the freedom. The U.K. seizing a ship for Iran oil, and then all of a sudden they're pretending that, oh, now we've got to get more involved. That's the interesting part. the U.S. has got to step up its activity in the region because of these events. Well, the U.S. put these events in play in the first place.
Right.
You know?
And I don't think it's going to settle down. You know, in a way, it's fortunate that nobody got shot or killed. But I think, you know, obviously, you know, the West, that's the British and us, believe the Iranians are, you know, under the gun and they're going to do something. They threaten to and they're liable to. But what they'll probably have to plan is to make sure, you know, who's to blame for what. So that's why there will be, fortunately, a lot of pictures taken, because most of the time when there's surveillance and there's knowledge, you know, it turns out that, you know, our side generally lies about what the Iranians are doing. But it's, it is going to still be a touchy situation, and it's so unnecessary. And I keep thinking that people should think more about preventative medicine.
Yeah.
And that is, what do we do to prevent things? How could we have prevented these wars, Iraq? Do we have to wait at $5 trillion, $6 trillion, and wait 18 years and all this suffering? And yet, you know, here we are still in Syria. We're really in all these countries, and we're determined. And there seems to be no hesitation whatsoever. We keep our fingers crossed about us having, you know, backing off on such a serious conflict with North Korea. But there's no hint of that right now. And we won't, there's no way we will hear about that in the presidential race coming up.
Yeah.
Those people that are running on the Democratic side, they've already exposed themselves that, you know, that they have to toe the line. And unless for one or two people, there's not going to be a discussion about that. So I think the conflict, nobody's going to get up right now and say, you know, we need to back off. I mean, why do we have to have a war with Iran? And it's almost like provoking the war so that they can go in. And Bolton, what was it when that attack occurred the other day? Bolton's there like a cheerleader.
This is great.
Great. Oh yeah, closer to war than ever.
Yeah.
It to me is sickening.
Yeah, it is. And that's really what brings these two topics together, and why we see seemingly disparate topics, but they're actually the same, because here we have the military themselves thinking, what a waste these wars have been, how stupid. And now we're looking at the neocons trying to get us into another one, trying to do the same thing over and over again. You know, it's funny, no one's talking about those mines anymore. Supposedly we had proof that the Iranians, it just goes off the screen.
It goes to something else.
Nobody cares about it. It's amazing. So I would just say that people should keep their eye out what's going to be the next provocation. People should be very skeptical.
But you know, the biggest handicap for our message getting out is the media.
Yeah.
Because it's over and over again. I mean, like this report came out, you know, as a matter of fact, I had to go looking. I wonder who made this report and said, oh, they failed, they tried, and we took care of them.
Yeah.
You know, a big victory. It was CNN, you know, and so you don't know that, but the media has so much control. You figure for years, I was always hopeful. Oh, we have social media. We can go here and we can put it out and get our message out, like our program here. But I think our audience already knows the handicaps we have to circulate our material.
Yeah.
So it is difficult. But I still am an optimist about the power of ideas, because just think in the old days, they didn't have radio or a television or anything. They had pamphleteering. And it spread, you know, and the messages got out. Maybe a little slower, but it might have been a little bit more accurate. So I think the ideas are the important thing. And we have our obstacles here. But I think there will be technology now. There's some people out there that I know they're smarter than I am about technology and how you get around these obstacles, and why we can't use you know, the media and the internet and all these programs available, because that is what's necessary, because we cannot depend on CNN. And of course, Trump's done a good job in pointing out CNN and MSNBC, but he doesn't give us the whole answer.
Yeah.
He wants his idea. He still wants to go, you know, he still wants to have a conflict with Iran, and he still has Bolton and Pompeo there. So that's hardly going to solve the problem.
And you are so right about the media. You know, they can't stand even what little reach we have. And it's amazing. On your Facebook, for example, you've got over 1 million followers, yet we put up an article and they clamp down and only a couple thousand people see it. They can't stand it getting out, but it does get out. So I would just close with a kind of a sad story. We want to remember a very good friend of ours who passed away last week. Bill Green is his name, and you may remember Bill was an extraordinary person. He was an educator, always educating people on the Ron Paul philosophy, the libertarian philosophy, a terrific guy. He is well known as the one individual in the Electoral College, an elector who gave Ron Paul his sole electoral vote in 2016. So that was Bill and Dr. Paul holding up the tally showing the one vote that he gave him. So an extraordinary man, very, very sad at his untimely passing, and he will greatly be missed. Dr. Paul?
You know, Bill was a great friend. It's really sad to have lost him. But, you know, when he made that decision to do that, he studying history, teaches history. As a matter of fact, he was in Lake Jackson, I think, when he died, and he was looking out for a job maybe at our college here. But he knew that legally he was permitted to be independent-minded, that he had no contractual obligation to vote for the so-called Republican nominee. Matter of fact, the Republicans in Texas were so mad at him that they immediately tried, and maybe they have already accomplished it, to make sure that nobody would ever do that again, that they had to march lockstep, you know, with the parties. But Bill had sorted that out and knew about it, and quite frankly, he was a true believer, and it's a sad loss for us. But we just need a lot more people like that, and we have a lot. I mean, his message, you know, here's an example. He was a teacher, and he taught a lot of people and had a lot of influence. He probably doesn't have any idea who he's influenced. It sort of reminds me of Hans Sennholz, who was at Grove City College. And he had studied under Mises. And he wasn't as well known as some of the economists, and yet he taught thousands and thousands of young people about Austrian economics. So nobody knows what the exposure can be. And even now, Bill is going to be remembered, and they're going to remember him for a special reason. And even though that seems minor, it was somewhat, you know, unusual, and yet he did come to our house here in Lake Jackson to present the official document that showed that he cast that particular vote. So we will miss him, but I know there's a lot of other people out there that have an independent spirit, and they will do whatever they can to spread the message of liberty. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.